Hi there, it's Lerald, and today I'm going to be talking about all 6 tank classes in Shadowlands. Here's the usual disclaimer that beta stuff is subject to change, although we're getting pretty close to the end of the line. It took me a little while to figure out exactly how I wanted to approach making this video. I thought about using a number system or letter grades for a while, but that just seemed like it wouldn't age well, especially with things still being changed every week. So I've decided just to talk about each of the tanks in some detail on what I think are the most important categories, then put them all into 2 different tier lists, one for rating and one for Mythic Plus. So here are the categories I'm going to use to rank each tank. Offense and defense, with active mitigation, self-healing, and defensive cooldowns all being part of defense. Mobility, utility, covenants, and legendaries. First off, there's going to be a lot of opinion here. I'm doing my best to consider numerical performance, but there's just no way around it. Tanking is a complicated subject, and ultimately, this is the way I see the tanks. Other people could feel differently. That's okay. And finally, before I move on, if major changes have happened to a class since I put out a preview on it, I'll try to cover those as well. This mostly means Paladin. They cannot stop making changes to Paladin. In terms of order, we're just going to go in the order I want to write these up in, so let's start with Monk. Monk has received a few changes since I put out the preview video for them. First, and most important, all of the terrifying bugs affecting the class have been fixed. Magic Stagger works, Provoke Sprint works, Blackout Kick triggers Mastery, and the Covenant abilities have all been fixed. Feline Stomp spawns under your feet now. This means you don't have to relog to make it work, it no longer misses enemies due to spawning behind them, and you don't have to move to trigger resets. You can cast it, stand still, keep fighting, and it will reset. I don't know whether Blizzard ever heard any of my thousands of complaints about Feline Stomp or not, but I choose to believe that they did and that I'm single-handedly responsible for getting it fixed. And that feels terrific. Monk has also gotten some nerfs. Celestial Brew had its cooldown doubled and its effect reduced by 40%. That's a 70% nerf, which is bad. It also came with a 33% nerf to Purifying Brew's cooldown, but that actually was a good change. The usage rate on Purifying Brew was so high that the best way to play Monk was just to macro Purifying Brew into everything, even at a really high level of play. Honestly, I think World First Race Monks could have gotten away with it just to dedicate that keybind to something more useful. I think this pulled the class back from that point without having to nerf Purifying Brew into the ground. Even with the Celestial Brew nerf, the class's base toolkit is tankier than it was in BFA. Alright, let's get to the categories here. Offensively, Monk has gained 2 offensive cooldowns from BFA, and that's nice. Ultimately, the class is one of the weakest tanks at dealing damage, and not only is that not changing, it's actually getting worse. Brewmaster has a good toolkit for picking up adds due to Keg Smash, but unfortunately, that's been subjected to square root scaling, which basically just means it splits damage among all the secondary targets it hits, and it really doesn't deal a lot of AoE damage anymore. Same goes for Breath of Fire, which was already terrible. It sucks, man. Ultimately, Monk is still a bad offensive tank with 1 good skill. That's enough to keep them competitive, but it's annoying. On to defense, and Monk's active mitigation is second to none. Stagger is the most reliable, consistent defensive tool in the game. I really don't even need to say anymore, so I won't. In terms of self-healing, the class has gotten a pretty big self-healing boost in the form of Celestial Brew and the revamp to Expel Harm. It's a long way from Warlords of Draenor Brewmaster in terms of self-healing, but Brewmaster for the past couple of expansions has basically needed a healer to babysit them at all times, and that won't be nearly as bad now. Monk has always been limited on defensive cooldowns, and that's still the case. You could argue Celestial Brew is a defensive cooldown, and you can certainly use it that way. It's effectively a 30-second cooldown on a huge shield, which is great. It's good as a CD or as a regular shield. Really, Monk's defensive strength has always been their constant defenses, and they've never needed more defensive cooldowns. Monk mobility is the best. It's always been the best, it probably always will be. It even got buffed with Clash being brought back. In terms of utility, Monks are a bit of a mixed bag. They have an AoE stun with Leg Sweep, an AoE knockback with Ring of Peace, or an AoE taunt with Black Ox Statue. That's all fine, but it's really not that big of a deal in a Mythic Plus situation. Monks also bring 5% more physical damage, and with Mistweaver and Windwalker always underperforming and always being unpopular, they look like Brewmasters are pretty much going to be a must-have in raids to get that debuff. In Mythic Plus, maybe not so much. Covenants are the fun part, and Monks are in a pretty good place with them. The nerf to Celestial Brew really cut the defensive value of Bone Dust Brew as well, so while it's not necessarily worthless, it is worth less. There are some concerns that Venthyr might actually be the best DPS option for raids because they can double dip from buffs like Bloodlust. That being said, it's very boring and it literally has no value other than dealing damage. It's basically a third DPS trinket. The other two options are way more interesting. Night Fae provides a lot of sustained AoE damage and it's easy to use now thanks to me. Kyrian provides a great offensive and defensive cooldown and an extra health potion. Ultimately, Brewmasters have a few competing options when it comes to Covenants, and I think Blizzard have actually done a decent job on this one. I just wish Venthyr provided even the tiniest bit of utility. Now, in terms of legendaries, I truly do not know how we went from the success of Brewmaster Covenants to the failure of Brewmaster Legendaries. The Keg Smash Shoulders are terrific. I fielded some comments and heard, even from other members of the Monk community, that they just add one extra Keg Smash per fight, what's so special about them? And that's just not true. First off, when you're playing a Monk, you run into this kind of decision tree all the time. Keg Smash and Celestial Brew just came off the cooldown at the same time. Keg Smash and Blackout Kick just came up at the same time. Keg Smash just came up at the same time as Rushing Jade Wind fell off. What skill do you cast first? By having a Keg Smash that has two charges, you circumvent all of those ability collisions. Additionally, and more importantly, without the Keg Smash legendary, Keg Smash's cooldown has hard breakpoints because Monk has a base 1 second GCD. So if the cooldown of Keg Smash is 6.8 seconds, the effective cooldown is 7 seconds. If it's 6.2 seconds, it's still 7 seconds. Because of high tolerance, your haste value tends to swing around a lot, so this can ultimately waste a lot of value in your stats when it comes to reducing the Keg Smash cooldown, which is the primary thing that haste does. The base cooldown of Keg Smash is 8 seconds, you need 14% haste to bring it down to 7, which is very easy to get, and 33% to get it down to 6, which is not easy and pretty wasteful. Anything between 14 and 33% is essentially totally wasted, which is really dumb. By having a second charge of Keg Smash, you remove that major impediment to haste scaling. It doesn't make haste good, but it does change it from being essentially a stat that doesn't do anything in between the breakpoints to still having decent value. There is also a Breath of Fire legendary that makes your filler skills deal some extra fire damage, and it's cute, but it's a lot weaker. By comparison, every single other one of the Brewmaster and General Monk legendaries is absolutely worthless garbage. The design of the other 6 options available to Brewmaster Monks is embarrassing. Half a second off the cooldown of Celestial Brew, 1.5% more damage reduction from armor while Celestial Brew is active, a 12% haste buff on a 3-minute cooldown. These are not bonuses. So what Monk has one very good legendary and one not great legendary, and everything else is worthless crap. Let's move on to DK. In terms of changes, almost nothing has happened. Ossuary was finally made baseline, which is awesome, and Blood Tap was moved into its place. Generally, you're going to still take it, so it's basically a non-change, but it does mean you could consider the other options in that talent tier if you wanted to, so I still consider it a small buff. Much like Monk, DK is a class defined by really only having one good damage dealing skill. Unfortunately for DK, their best offensive skill is Death Strike, which is single target. The good news is the rest of their offensive kit doesn't suck as much as Brewmasters now. Blood Boil and Death and Decay are totally untouched by AoE caps, so while the class has never been great at dealing AoE damage, it isn't any worse in Shadowlands than it was in BFA. It's as bad as always, and that's better than Monk, or really most of the other classes can say for themselves. Gauging active mitigation for DKs has always been a bit of a mixed bag. Are we including Death Strike, or does that go under self-healing? It's both really, and it's terrific. In terms of the actual mitigation though, Bone Shield sucks. It's boring, it's just a lazy maintenance buff, and while it's very easy to maintain at 100% uptime, it's not very strong. 50% of strength as armor? Warriors get 90% of strength as armor as a passive, and they get to wear shields too. Druid's Iron Fur is 100% of agility to armor, and they can stack it multiple times. Blood's mitigation isn't good, but it is easy to keep up. I think that's about the nicest thing I can say about it. In terms of self-healing, on the other hand, Blood DKs are second to none. They are simply the best, better than all the rest. With Rune Tap going baseline and DKs getting both Lichborn and Anti-Magic Zone added to the class, Blood's really got a nice collection of defensive cooldowns now. Icebound Fortitude is still only 30%, and Dancing Rune Weapon isn't great, so Blood isn't quite at the level of Warriors, but they are looking a lot better. In terms of mobility, DK has always been bad. Fortunately, their two best Covenants grant pretty decent mobility skills, so I think that winds up helping out the class a lot. It's still a slow class though. For utility, Blood can be a little hard to evaluate, because a lot of it is very situational. That being said, when Blood's utility is needed, it's absolutely irreplaceable. Death Grip is strong, Gorfine's Grasp is strong, AMS is strong, Combat Res is strong. When you factor in the return of Lichborn and Anti-Magic Zone, they've gotten even better when they were already really good in BFA. In terms of Mythic plus utility, there's no tank with as much power as DK. In terms of raid utility, it's so heavily impacted by the fight specifics. DK can be low value, almost worthless, or they can be absolutely mandatory and irreplaceable, just depending on whether there's a fight where you need grips or not. And actually today, an Engineering Combat Res was just re-added on the beta, which makes the issue of DK bringing Battle Res a lot less mandatory in Mythic Plus. It's still very good to have, but it's a little bit less of a you've gotta have a Blood DK or else kind of issue. In terms of Covenants, Blood DK has the strongest one of all 24 abilities available to tanks. A constant 15% damage reduction and strength increase is absolutely insane, and we're far enough along that I'm starting to suspect it's not going to be changed before it hits live servers. If it stays like it is, or if it gets nerfed down to something like 12%, I still think DK is going to be the best defensive class. Beyond their Night Fae ability, the Venthyr ability is also really good in Mythic Plus and pretty fun, so you don't just have the #1 rating in Mythic Plus pushing Covenant skill in the whole game, you also have one of the most fun and cool Mythic Plus speedrunning skills too. Pretty nice. As far as legendaries go, Blood DKs have a couple of interesting options. The frontrunner is Bryndoor's Might, since it gives back 15% of your runic power, and because you only use runic power to cast Death Strike, that's essentially 15% more healing, which is really good. One thing I didn't mention in the preview video for DK is that the talent Voracious has a hidden passive that increases the minimum healing of Death Strike by 50%, which pushes the minimum amount up to 10.5%. That's more than enough to ensure that every single cast triggers Bryndoor's Might. There are a couple of other legendary alternatives as well. You can use the Dancing Rune Weapon legendary to get more runes, or Pheromones to get more haste. I don't think either of those are quite as good, but they are at least decent alternatives. The rest of the options are all pretty mediocre. Not brain dead awful like Monks are, just not as appealing. Alright, let's move on to Paladin. I'll start by saying the class has been redesigned since I did the preview video on it, and it's actually been redesigned several times. It's getting a little annoying, to be honest. As of right now, Avenger's Shield grants 1 holy power per cast, regardless of how many targets it hits. Judgment again generates 1 holy power per cast, but no longer reduces the cost of Word of Glory. Instead, you get a free Word of Glory after every 5 times you cast Shield of the Righteous. What a weird design. Some of the Shield of the Righteous defensive power has been shifted into Consecration, which makes the class a little tankier against magic damage and a little less spiky, and that's, I think, generally a good thing. Also, just earlier today, the DPS conduits and legendaries for Prot Pally were nerfed, and the class definitely deals less damage than it has. It should still be the best tank at dealing damage, I think, by a pretty decent margin, but it shouldn't be embarrassing main spec DPS anymore. While we're on the subject of offense, Pallies are terrific at it. They do tons of single target damage in between Wings and Covenant abilities and Hammer of Wrath. They have excellent DPS cooldowns that synergize with an excellent DPS rotation and an excellent execute. Pally's even got a version of anger management in Shadowlands, and it's really nice. This is Pally's greatest strength. Are Pallies the new warriors? Not exactly, but yeah, kinda. Active mitigation is Pally's greatest weakness, and it always will be. Shield of the Righteous has swung back and forth between being really powerful and being undertuned, but the gaps in its uptime are the real problem. This is probably the hardest part of evaluating Paladins. They're really good in the majority of content, but eventually when pushing Mythic Plus up high enough or when doing Mythic raids while you're under-geared, you reach points where you can't live through hits without Shield of the Righteous active, and that really holds the class back in a way that monks, TKs, and even warriors don't struggle as much. Maybe even druids for that matter. Pally self-healing has swung back and forth a whole bunch of times in terms of usability in Shadowlands, and it seems like it's finally reached a point where it's somewhat useful, but definitely less available than it has been in BFA. Ultimately, you can just use Word of Glory on yourself for 3 holy power if you absolutely need the healing, and it does do a pretty good chunk of healing if your health is low. But it is a big sacrifice defensively to hard cast a self-heal. It's probably not worth doing most of the time, and they haven't fixed the real issue, which is the GCD. Pally's self-healing just isn't as good as it has been in BFA. Righteous Protector does help cut the cooldown of Guardian of Ancient Kings a little bit, so Pally's still doing pretty well in terms of defensive cooldowns. Having Final Stand moved to a tier where it's competing against real talents is a pretty good sized nerf. In Mythic Plus, it feels like you've lost out on a powerful defensive cooldown. Other than that, the class is still doing pretty well on the cooldown front. Paladin has horrendous baseline mobility, it always has, and while the Covenant abilities can help, it's still a slow class. For as much as players, including myself, have complained about DKs being slow, Pally is worse. In terms of utility, Pallies are one of the best classes in the game. They bring Blessing of Sacrifice, Freedom, Protection, or Spell Warding. They now bring stupid auras, so get ready to enjoy 3% damage reduction or 20% mount speed. A clutch lay on hands can save a run. It's a class with a ton of utility just like it always has been. A lot of it can be brought by a Holy Pally, or a Ret Pally I guess, but given the duration of the buffs and the cooldowns of the buffs, having 2 or more Paladins in a group is almost never a bad thing defensively. They offer just a ton of defensive value to everyone in the group. And of course, all of this pales in comparison to the utility of having like 50,000 interrupts a run from Avenger's Shield. Covenants have been changed around since I previewed the class. The Vinthyr Ashen Hollow was massively buffed. It's actually an AoE now. It ticks faster with haste, but its duration remains 30 seconds no matter what, so it is incredibly powerful when lined up with Bloodlust. It still has the same problem of granting uses of Hammer of Wrath just like Wings, so you'll want to use both of them together to maximize your DPS, but you want to use them both separately to maximize your hammer usage. Ultimately, I'm confident that the right call is just to use Wings while Ashen Hollow is active just to maximize your damage. Blessing of Seasons was nerfed, with Autumn only granting 30% cooldown reduction now. It's a really weak covenant now. I think it's not worth running. If you really want to be a buff bot or you just like the Night Fae because they're pretty, go for it, but it's not worth giving up a real covenant to get. Kyrian is the same as it was, and Necrolord technically is too, but with the reduction in the availability of free Words of Glory, it has been indirectly nerfed by quite a bit. It's really not very good anymore. So you have Ashen Hollow as a powerful but long and kind of weird cooldown for rating in Mythic Plus, I guess, or Kyrian as a really good shorter cooldown that's primarily more suited towards Mythic Plus. I think this is one of Paladin's weaker spots, but you still have a good option available for everything you want to do. Making the Vinthyr Covenant ability into an AoE smoothed over a lot of its problems. It's not perfect, the cooldown is still insanely long, but it's way more usable now than it was, and I actually think I might play Vinthyr over Kyrian now. I'm still not totally sure. In terms of legendaries, Pally has two really good ones. Bulwark of Righteous Fury only adds damage, and it was nerfed earlier today, but it's still pretty good. When you combine it with all the other potential damage bonuses such as Judgment and Potency Conduits, it can really add up to add a ton of damage. Holy Avenger's Engraved Sigil, aka Holy Gem, is just a terrific source of even more interrupts damage and holy power. It's great. The Magistrate's Judgment is also an interesting option, although maybe more of a single target choice. It doesn't synergize as well with Righteous Protector as Holy Gem, but it's still pretty good. The rest of the legendary toolkit isn't all that impressive, but you know, 3 good options is more than enough. Moving on to Warrior, the only major change made to Warrior since I previewed it is that Blizzard buffed Vigilance, their passive strength to armor conversion, by another 15%. So just to recap, at the start of BFA it was 40%. Throughout BFA it's been bumped up to 60%. Then for most of beta it was 75%. Now it's 90%. It's not necessarily a massive buff, but it will make warrior health pools a little bit more stable in between shield block casts, and that's obviously a very good thing. Warrior offense, despite the nerfs to anger management and the loss of Azerite and essences, is still pretty nice. You really have 2 available playstyles. An Avatar Thunderclap spamming build that's pretty similar to the current BFA playstyle, but you can pick up Devastator to buff your rage generation and single target DPS as well, or a slower, a bit more disconnected setup that has a lot more offensive cooldowns but not as much synergy between the base abilities. The second playstyle tends to do a lot more burst damage, of course, but the core rotation is sloppier. Ultimately, I think having multiple approaches is a good thing. You can stick to what's comfortable, or you can try something new and see what works best for each situation. I think the only downside is that even at its best, Warrior isn't as good as Pally at single target damage, and with Blizzard deliberately nerfing AoE damage throughout the game, Warrior's strong suit has become a lot weaker. Offensively, I still think the class is good, it just has lost some ground. I also forgot to mention that Execute's back and it's a good single target damage increase. I guess I put about as much thought into it as the class developer did. It just feels like such an overthought, especially after going over Paladin's Execute. Theirs is awesome and it feels like a great bonus that really works well with the rotation. The Warrior Execute doesn't at all. It's a single target rage dump that you really only want to use in non-threatening single target fights. So against trash, no thank you. Bummer. Alright, let's talk active mitigation. Warrior has similar issues with its active mitigation as Paladin, but not nearly to the same degree. A lot of the issues of gaps in shield block uptime can be fixed with talents. You really just have to decide whether you want an extra 20% or so shield block uptime, or you want the whole anger management playstyle. I think the fact that there is a talent setup that can have pretty high uptime on shield block means that one of the biggest concerns about Warrior's competitiveness in high-level Mythic Plus really gets wiped away. Still, there are gaps in shield block, and those can be pretty dangerous, so it's still less reliable than DK or Monk. In terms of self-healing, Warrior has none. It has Ignore Pain, which is a great mitigation tool, but it's not healing. But Warrior does have Indomitable now, and that's a nice little trickle of self-healing. The nerfs to anger management really cut into Warrior's defensive cooldowns in a big bad way, but the small buffs to Shield Wall and Rallying Cry aren't bad, and the return of the Demo Shout belt really helps cover up a big part of the anger management nerf, so I think Warrior still has a really good toolkit in terms of defensive cooldowns. Spell Reflection is still amazing too, and another positive thing about the advent of Ravager as a usable talent and the Covenant abilities is that they are good rage generators, so while Warrior defensive cooldowns are nerfed, they're not nearly as bad as we initially feared. Mobility is down from BFA with Charge and Intervene being separated. You're now forced into talenting into getting back your second charge, and Intervene is a 30-second cooldown no matter what. It's a nerf. That being said, Warrior is still super duper mobile. Warriors are another weird case when it comes to evaluating utility. I guess everyone is, it's the weirdest part of the kit to consider. But, you know, Warriors have Rallying Cry and Intervene and Spell Reflection, and those are all really good. Battle Shout is also okay, but unlike Monk, Warriors off-specs are both really good, fun, and popular, so getting that buff is usually pretty easy. Maybe one of the best and worst things about Warriors in Shadowlands is the weird overlap in their covenants. While I would argue that the difference between the way that Arms Fury and Prot's Venthyr covenant function is probably the single biggest piece of evidence you could use to show why the entire covenant choice system is such a huge mistake. It's game-changing for Fury, it absolutely completes the spec. It's not quite as mandatory for Arms, but it's still very, very strong. For Prot, it's really only a useful skill in single target, and even then it's a defensive loss, so it's really only useful in single target that isn't super duper threatening. That's so frustrating. That being said, both Kyrian and Night Fae are really good options for Prot. They have a lot of overlap, with Kyrian working better in single target and large scale AoE, and Night Fae working better against 3 to 5 targets. Technically speaking, Night Fae deals like 1% more damage per second in all situations, but it forces you to tank in the stomp area for the next 12 seconds, whereas Kyrian forces you to stay in one spot for 4. Kyrian also gives you 25 rage up front, whereas Night Fae gives you your rage over 12 seconds. It's weird, but the positive is that you have two options that are relatively competitive with each other. Also, Necrolord for Warrior is still terrible. So anyway, it's kind of a mixed bag for Warriors on Covenants, but you have two good ones that provide really strong offensive cooldowns, and that's good. In terms of legendaries, your options are more constrained. You have the Demo Shout legendary or the group Spell Reflection legendary, which I wouldn't be surprised to see get nerfed. I don't think any of the other options are really very competitive. The Demo Shout uptime is very, very good in AoE, especially with the Avatar Unstoppable Force setup. You can easily get the cooldown to be shorter than the duration. Even in single target without Avatar, this legendary shaves about 15 seconds off the cooldown of Demo Shout, which is pretty decent. I would say it's a similar situation to Monks, where you have one really good option amongst a bunch of junk, but the Group Reflect can be really strong, and the fallback options, if either of those get nerfed, aren't as bad. A few days after last week's DH preview video, in which I tried my best to be positive about Demon Hunter and thought I was mostly successful, but ultimately felt like the class hadn't quite gained enough power in Shadowlands, Blizzard nerfed them extremely hard. They cut Spirit Fragment healing by 25%. They nerfed Soul Cleave's total healing by 15%. They nerfed Feast of Souls by 20%. They increased Fell Devastation's cooldown by 15 seconds, and nerfed the Demonic Metamorphosis duration by 2 seconds, which is about a 33% nerf to its uptime. So yeah, it's bad. It's a bad class now. The offense for Demon Hunter is still good. It's very different from Pally and Warrior in that it's a constant, steady stream of good AoE damage. Your Covenant skills do add decent DPS cooldowns as either AoE or single target, and that's good too. There's not a ton more to say here. It's very consistent offensively, and if you opt to play Spirit Bomb, then you have Leech in the toolkit, which is helpful, especially in light of the nerf to the other self-healing in the kit. I think the lack of great burst damage options ultimately will hold Demon Hunter back when compared to Warrior and Paladin. The biggest problem I have with Demon Hunter, even after last week's nerfs, is the gaps in between demon spikes. The cooldown is really long and the class is very weak when it's not up. Their self-healing and demonic metamorphosis helped cover those gaps up, but those have both been nerfed. The demon spikes gaps are deadlier than ever now, and that's bad. Self-healing for the class is still pretty good. It's worse than it was, obviously. I don't want to overreact, but DH self-healing hadn't been buffed from BFA, and ultimately Demon Hunters were kind of a bottom tier tank throughout the entire expansion. That doesn't mean they didn't work. Like I said in the preview, Demon Hunters could solo tank Drestagath. They weren't competitive with monks and warriors, and their healing wasn't enough to bridge the gap. Now they have 25% less of it. It's bad. But their self-healing is ultimately still the big positive of the defensive aspects of their kit. Defensive cooldowns are the biggest weakness of Demon Hunters. Now, since the nerfs last week, Demon Hunter Theory Crafters have entered into the bargaining stage, and they're looking at the Soul Cleave Legendary and the Fiery Brand Conduit and realizing that they can maybe get Fiery Brand down to about a 30-second cooldown and a 14-ish second duration, which means it would be about 50% uptime. That's really good in single target, and obviously with talents you can spread it around a little bit in AoE, and that's potentially very useful. The problem that I have with that playstyle is that it sacrifices all of the potential offensive power of the class. Obviously you have to give up Spirit Bomb, and Fiery Brand is ultimately still a frustrating, clumsy, on GCD defensive skill. I think this playstyle will see some use, and it could be sort of one redeeming quality for an otherwise problematic class. Outside of that setup, I think Vengeance Demon Hunter probably has the worst defensive cooldowns of any of the tanks. In terms of mobility, what can you say? Demon Hunter has 2 demonic leaps on a pretty short cooldown. That's it, but it's very good. Demon Hunter utility is kind of complicated, and that's because it's pretty much all tied up in sigils. Because sigils explode on a 2-second delay, they can be a lot tougher to use effectively than arguably less powerful skills like, for example, I would rather have a Paladin's Avenger Shield silences than a Demon Hunter's AoE silence. I would rather have a DK Scorpion's Grasp than a Demon Hunter's Sigil of Chains. And I think I would rather have a Warrior's Intimidating Shout than a Demon Hunter's Sigil of Misery. That being said, Vengeance Demon Hunter does have 3 nice AoE crowd control skills, and that's pretty cool for one tank to bring all of that. It's just harder to use all of it than the utility every other class brings, and I think that holds the class back. Demon Hunter also brings 5% magic damage taken, which is a good debuff, but Havoc Demon Hunters do too, and they're still pretty popular. It's just not hard to get that debuff into any group, Mythic Plus or Raid. Covenants for Demon Hunter are pretty straightforward, since they mostly just add damage. It's really just a choice between Kyrian and Venthyr, and both of their defensive benefits are small enough that, to me, they really aren't a huge factor. Do you want AoE damage or single target damage? You have a choice of both, and both of them have pretty good conduits and soulbinds, so you have 2 good competitive options. That's good. I wish they offered more defensive value, or at least that the Necrolord one didn't suck, but oh well. Demon Hunters are doing really poorly in terms of legendaries too. The most appealing option is the Fell Devastation one, which took a hit in value thanks to the nerf to Demonic. The Soul Cleave Fiery Brand one is also available as an option, but I just think that playstyle is pretty boring. I don't love it. I feel bad for DH when it comes to legendaries. The class is just kind of straight up missing out on an entire expansion level feature. Again. On to Druids. Bear Druids have received a few changes since I made their preview video last week. First of all, Mangle and Maul now slow the target by 50% for 12 seconds. This isn't a huge deal in a lot of situations, but it will help with kiting a little bit, and that's good. Lunar Beam was finally removed and replaced with a new talent named Tooth and Claw, which gives your attacks a chance to proc a buff that makes your Maul into a very minor defensive cooldown. Right now this is bugged, and when you apply the debuff to a target multiple times in a row, the damage decrease will stack. You can get over 100% damage reduction. That's not intended. Bears aren't going to have permanent Divine Shield. Because it's single target only and requires Spinning Rage on Maul instead of Iron Fur, I think this talent's not going to be super competitive in the tier compared to just using Rend and Tear, but at least they finally replaced Lunar Beam. It is funny that this talent overlaps so heavily with Pulverize, which is also right next to it, and I do think Tooth and Claw is just clearly a better option. No cooldown, pretty close in strength with way higher uptime, and it doesn't require you to sacrifice DPS to use it. Yet again, Bear Druids have two overlapping, competing bonuses. Also, Moonfire had its dot damage buffed by about 20%. It should help out with both single target and AoE DPS a little bit, nothing major. Additionally, one of Bear's worst legendaries received a major buff. Ursoc's Lingering Spirit now makes Thrash shield you for 100% of the damage it deals. That includes the direct damage and the dot. It's very, very good, and it gives Bear a constant source of defensive value that scales up pretty nicely into AoE. I feel pretty confident that this is going to be the best legendary for Bear now in nearly every situation. Offense is probably the weakest part of Bear Druid's toolkit. They do have two decent Covenant abilities that can help with that a little bit, but it's just not very strong offensively. It's kind of a baby class. It's simple, it's easy to play, but it just doesn't have a lot going on. It's basic, but at least it hasn't been nerfed in AoE as hard as Monk. In terms of active mitigation, Bears are one of the most consistent tanks, really I think just behind Monks. Iron Fur is very strong, and keeping it active at more than 100% uptime is very easy. There are some problems with diminishing returns there. Really, it's like they tried to make Iron Fur be both shield block and ignore pain, and it's not really either. Still, whether you're in Mythic Plus or in Raid, Bears are pretty consistent defensively, and that's good. It's one of the best things they have going for them. The constant self-shielding from the newly buffed Thrash legendary is also a very nice bonus. Self-healing is where Bears really struggle. Frenzied Regen is still on the GCD for some reason, the cooldown is still insanely long, and it still heals for less than it did in BFA. Bears did get Renewal back as a talent, although it's in the Feral Charge tier. Ultimately, Bear's self-healing is terrible. Bear's defensive cooldowns are pretty decent. There's nothing bad with them, but nothing really all that special either. It's just a very basic, simple defensive cooldown toolkit. There is a Barkskin-oriented playstyle that could emerge. My problems with it are about the same as the ones I have with the Fiery Brand playstyle for Demon Hunter, but it is better for a couple of reasons. First, Barkskin isn't on the GCD, which is just a lot less annoying than Fiery Brand. Also, it's not single target, and it's not even on the enemy at all, so it will work just as well in AoE or against environmental damage like Bursting or Explosive, while that Demon Hunter setup does not have that going for it. Ultimately, I don't want to give up the cooler, more fun legendaries to build around Barkskin, but it is an option, and options are generally good. Bear mobility is sort of weird. Feral Charge is pretty simple and good, Stampeding Roar is good and great for your group, but beyond that you basically have nothing. You can use your Interrupt to charge into melee range, you can shift into cat form and use dash if you're not actively tanking, but if you are, you're pretty slow. It's a step up from DK and Pally, but also a big step down from Warrior and DH. Again, Bear utility is very weird. You have so many options, but a lot of them are difficult to use. You can't shift out and heal or deal damage while you're actively tanking. You can mass root or Ursol's Vortex and run away to heal for a couple of seconds, but that's about it, and it won't work against archers or casters or enemies immune to slows. Beyond the shape-shifting utility, there's some good stuff there. Battle Res is good, being able to stealth is cool, Decurse and Soothe are good. It's all good, but it can pretty much all be brought by a Balanced Druid or a Resto Druid, so it's not special. For a class that's supposed to be the utility class, bears are kind of disappointing. When it comes to covenants, bears are in a pretty nice spot. They have a good single target damage and healing option with Necrolord, an okay but not great DPS cooldown with Night Fae, and a really good cooldown from Venthyr that synergizes magnificently with their legendaries and talents. It's really nice, but they really don't have a good defensive option. The Night Fae one got slightly better with today's buff to the Thrash legendary, but I don't think it improved enough to justify taking over Venthyr. The Venthyr Covenant has nice defensive value when combined with the Thrash legendary, and the synergy there is pretty magnificent. The damage Ravenous Frenzy deals to you if you let it fall off was cut down by 66% as well. I still don't really understand why it deals damage to you at all, no other Covenant has this kind of drawback, but it really should never be an issue. If you get stunned while it's active, the stun and the cancel is suspended until you regain control of your character, so there should never be a situation in which you let the buff fall off early. In terms of legendaries, I've already mentioned it, but Ursoc's Fury Remembered was massively buffed today, and it totally rules. It has good all-around value at all times, it gets better while in AoE, and it interacts really nicely with Incarnation and Ravenous Frenzy. What's not to love? Bears also have a good option in Legacy of the Sleeper that gives synergy with their Covenant and their best talent setup, and it's still pretty good. But wait, there's more! There's actually a lot more options for bears, and they really are in the best spot of all 6 tanks in terms of legendaries. They have good options that have a positive impact on the class, and when we're able to wear 2 at once, which, I don't know, maybe patch 9.1? Whenever that happens, Bear's going to become incredibly strong overnight just from being able to combine Ursoc's Fury with Lufa-infused Embrace. Alright, we made it to the end of the class-specific breakdowns, and now it's time for me to do a big comparison. As you can see, I've got a very basic tier list made up here. This one is for raids, and I'll do the Mythic Plus one afterwards. So, just starting here, we have DK and Monk up at the top, Warrior and Pally in the middle, and Bear and Demon Hunter down at the bottom. I'm just going to talk about each tier, why I put the 2 classes that are in it are in there, and how they're going to compare to each other. So, let's start with the top. In terms of rating, I legitimately think you can expect DK and Monk to both be extremely popular. I suspect a lot of the guilds racing for World First will run DK Monk or double DK or double Monk. Monk, I think, has a small advantage in raids just simply due to the smoothness of stagger. Even with DK gaining Rune Tap and Death's Due, Monk is probably going to wind up being a little tankier due to Celestial Brew. Either way, I think the 2 classes are close in value. Warrior and Paladin are in the middle of the pack, and I really do think they are both competitive tanks. I would put Paladin slightly ahead of Warrior for rating due to the great single target damage they deal, but defensively, I think they're fairly evenly matched. They're both good tanks, they both bring a lot of utility and have great cooldowns, but they have inconsistent active mitigation, and that clearly puts them a notch below Monk and DK in my eyes as raid tanks. At the bottom of the pack, Bear Druid and Vengeance Demon Hunter are just another step behind that middle tier of tanks. Bear basically has the opposite of the problem it has in Mythic Plus. You can shift out of bear form when your off-tank is tanking and cat weave or owl weave or throw around heals, but it doesn't really have a huge amount of impact for a Bear Druid to heal when you've got a whole healing team. And all the other utility you could bring, like Decurse or Soothe, really doesn't matter when there's like a dozen other casters in your raid who could do it instead. Demon Hunter is a step below Bear as a raid tank due to their recent self-healing nerfs. They still have self-healing, but they really needed all they had to cover up the shortcomings of their low active mitigation uptime and their limited defensive cooldowns. That nerf really exposed their weaknesses in a bad way. They're the least reliable tank defensively, and that's just not good in raids. Alright, let's move on to the Mythic Plus tier list, and as you can see, it's a little different. DK is clearly the top dog. In Season 1 of BFA, Blood DKs made up more than 50% of on-time 15s. Now, prior to the Engineering Battle Res being added today, I was expecting to see that number go up in Season 1 of Shadowlands. Now, even before that change, I think there are good reasons to play other tanks in Mythic Plus. I like all the other tanks in the middle pack more than DK, if I'm being honest. But between Death's Due, Death Strike, and Death Grip, Death Knight is a tremendous tank for Mythic Plus. Bringing a battle res is still very good. Engineers being able to do it in Shadowlands means that DK will probably still be the best, most popular tank in Mythic Plus, but it shouldn't be the tank in like 65% of on-time runs over 15, which I really think it could have been. But there is still a serious fight going on for second place. Despite how good they are in raids, I actually think Monk could wind up being the fourth best class here behind Pally and Warrior. Their toolkit is so good for raids, but for Mythic Plus, their small health pool, their lack of defensive cooldowns, and their horrendous damage output can be a real problem. While I'm inclined to think that Pally is probably the best tank of the middle pack for Mythic Plus and Shadowlands, their self-healing is down from BFA, and the gaps in Shield of the Righteous uptime are major concerns. Warrior has their own concerns with shield block uptime, but generally speaking, you can do a pretty good job of laying out long stretches of shield block uptime, whereas Shield of the Righteous is going to be up and down all fight long no matter what you do. When it comes to playing with pug groups, I think Paladin is absolutely the better choice. The interrupts from Avenger Shield can carry even really bad groups. Ask me how I know. Pally's self-healing also makes them a lot better at carrying an unprepared or undergeared healer than a warrior, and their damage output can help make up for a bad damage dealer better than any other tank. In terms of super high-level Mythic Plus pushing, I think Warrior might wind up being the better choice due to having better defensive cooldowns and a much higher baseline of armor than any other tank. But then again, it could just be Monk. Stagger's powerful. Monks were the #1 tank during BFA Season 3 when Eternal Palace ads were scattered throughout dungeons because they could tank damage that other tanks couldn't. With the anti-crowd control ads coming back in Shadowlands as a weekly affix, Monks could really shine on those weeks. In the bottom tier, while I initially thought that even with the nerfs to their self-healing and metamorphosis uptime, Demon Hunter would be the better tank for Mythic Plus, the change to Bear's Thrash Legendary today has probably put them ahead. When you compare Demon Hunter to Bear, Demon Hunter has more self-healing and better crowd control utility thanks to AoE Silence and Sigil of Chains, and they have a lot more damage output than Bear's. But Bear is way more reliable defensively, especially with the Thrash Shield Legendary, and I think that will wind up making them a better option for Mythic Plus. Their damage is fairly low outside of the 3-minute cooldown combo, and kind of like DH, their utility is a lot more complicated than the stuff that DK and Pally bring to a group. They are very different tanks. I think Bear will perform better in terms of pushing high-level Mythic Plus than Demon Hunter, just because they're so much tankier right now, but I don't think that the difference will be enormous. And finally, I have a third bonus tier list that's absolutely not an evaluation of how good everything is, it's just simply how much fun do I have playing it. And it looks like this. Pally is very fun again. I think it's the most fun tank class now. Bringing back Holy Power rocks. Even if it causes some problems for them early in pulls, it's just a much more fun playstyle than the Legion and BFA style of Paladin. I also enjoy Warrior and Monk both very much, which is good because I have an obligation to play them due to the Wowhead guides, but I actually like playing them. I think they've both gained enough new stuff to remain fun while still being pretty true to what I've liked about both of them in BFA. I put Demon Hunter next for a pretty simple reason. They deal solid AoE damage, and doing AoE damage is fun. They are also mobile, and being mobile is fun. Even if they aren't a competitive or particularly deep class, they can still be pretty fun in dungeons. Druid is also right next to Demon Hunter, just above the bottom for a couple of reasons. While the class's base damage is pretty bad, their big offensive cooldown combo is pretty awesome, and I really like that they have something big and new and strong. It's very fun and noticeable. I wish the cooldown were shorter or that the class was a little stronger in between the cooldowns, and I really wish that Frenzied Regen was off the GCD, but, you know, it is what it is. DK is down at the bottom of this list, and look, I understand why the class is good right now. I will play it, but I'm pretty tired of the playstyle of Blood from Legion and BFA. The biggest issue I have with DK is that it just doesn't feel different at all in Shadowlands due to the best Covenant ability being a passive. Technically, you will prioritize hardcasting Death and Decay in some situations where you wouldn't have in BFA, and getting a massive power increase as a passive is arguably better than getting it as an active skill, since it doesn't require learning anything new, but that doesn't make it more fun. It means it's the same, and going on 4 years of playing the exact same DK build is getting boring to me. If you love to play Blood DK and BFA, you're going to be for a really good time in Shadowlands because it's almost exactly the same class, it's just a lot stronger. Okay, we're almost done here. Lots of tank talk from me today. In doing these videos, I've really only looked at Shadowlands through the lens of the tank class design, and I think that's okay. I do look at the characters you play as the most important aspect of interacting with the game. I mean, am I wrong? What I mean is, I haven't really talked about the Covenant system, or Soulbinds, or Torghast, or any of that, and that's for a couple of reasons. First, it's controversial. No matter what stance you take, a lot of people are going to be upset. I also think other people have done a much better job of covering these issues impartially, and without showing their frustration, better than I could. But I will say this. Covenant abilities being hidden behind a weekly lockout is dumb. I want to play Venthyr Fury Warrior and Kyrian Prot Warrior. In order to do that, I have to make and gear 2 different characters of the same class. That's not fun, it's dumb, and it just exposes how bad the ability design and tuning can be. As of right now, there isn't a single tank I would recommend taking Necrolord as their Covenant. Not one. That's a design failure. It really frustrates me because I want to experience everything that WoW has to offer. I came out of healer retirement for like 10 years to get the Mistweaver Mage Tower appearance and then immediately went back into healer retirement. It drives me insane that I'm either going to have to make my Druid a Necrolord when I want it to be Venthyr, or level my terrible Rogue in order to see the Necrolord content. And for people who don't have mental problems that make them play 6 characters and just play 1, you're missing out on 3/4 of the game's story content. That's dumb. So, you know, what's my point here? It's not to make people upset about Shadowlands. It seriously is not. I think Shadowlands is going to be fun. I think it's going to be more fun than BFA, which isn't a high bar, but I think it'll probably be more fun than Legion was too. My point with all of these videos is to help both myself and other players get a more clear understanding of how the tanks will play in Shadowlands. If choosing your class is the most important decision you make in the way you play WoW, and I think that it is, then having a clear understanding about what's good, what's bad, fun, and annoying about the class you're considering playing is the most important thing to know. Hopefully between this video and the class previews, I've helped some of you guys out with choosing what to play in Shadowlands. There really is something appealing for everyone in every single one of the classes. So, you know, if there's a class that you like and I rated it lower than some of the other classes, that doesn't mean that it's bad or that you shouldn't play it. It just means that you're probably going to be going against the flow. and that's okay. Alright, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions or comments, well, you know where they go. If there are any more sudden changes to any of the classes, I'll put them and some commentary into a pinned comment. I'm gonna go get some ice cream. Thanks for watching. Bye.